sadly, we will never know. That branch of the tradition died out with Manco Sneed. He was the last one. And there are efforts underway to revitalize that are really incredible. But for the time being, if you want to check out more native fiddling stuff, I would definitely recommend looking up Métis music from the upper Midwest, checking out what's happening over in Oklahoma, check out what's happening in Canada and what's happening in Athabascan communities in Alaska.
Historically, the Appalachian Mountains south of the Mason-Dixon line have produced a creative crucible for the fusion of several musical forms. There, Native American, African American, and European traditions crossed paths and cross-pollinated to create a uniquely rich cultural sound. The songs of the region have been passed down from generation to generation, and they celebrate not only the quiet beauty of the mountains, but also the fire and passion of real lives, lived filled with hardship and struggle, and capturing the light and darkness of human relationships. Well, I'm not going to waste any more time talking. I know you came to hear the music. So I'm handing you over to Paddy Swanson, the very knowledgeable artistic director for the Revels. Welcome, Paddy.
Well, I'm afraid the only knowledge I deal in is very homespun or esoteric, and as my wife might tell you, mostly useless. Robert Johnson, that we just heard about, actually was known to have sold his soul to the devil at the Crossroads. That's a kind of ancient trope in American history. And since our show this year, the Christmas Revels, starts at a crossroads, I think maybe we should start this evening at a crossroads, and I think that's where Revels and Appalachia intersect. First, a bit about Revels. Revels, we're actually approaching our 50th year of existence, and we're approaching the 100th birthday of our founder, who's John Langstaff. So it was founded in 1971. John Langstaff, or Jack as we called him, was a concert baritone, a magic maker, had a career that was quite extraordinary. He was born in Brooklyn Heights. As a boy, he was a boy soprano at Grace Church. And his parents were great music lovers and great party givers. And it's quite likely that the birth of the Christmas Revels, that idea of celebration, really came out of the carol parties that his parents had in Brooklyn Heights around the fireplace with his mother playing the piano. Later on, he went to Juilliard and to the Curtis School. He was the protege of Vaughan Williams. His records were produced by George Martin, who later went on to be dubbed by the Queen and produce the Beatles records. He was the fifth Beatle. But before that, about 1935, when Jack was around 15 and his time as a boy soprano was over, his voice had just broken, his teacher at his New York school and his mentor, Carol Preston, persuaded his parents that she'd like to take him on a little trip to the mountains, and she took Jack to the White Top Festival in Marion, Virginia. Now, the White Top Festival didn't exist for very long. I didn't realize that, but it was a fairly short period, and it was almost exclusively Appalachian music. Jack had really, he'd gone to Wagner, and he'd had a great sort of musical education, but his sort of interaction with folk music or traditional music was almost zero. And this was an eye-opener. What he said was he met a whole bunch of people, but the most interesting thing were the aged Appalachian singers. His quote was, "At first, I could not imagine that someone with an old cracked voice could get up in front of people and sing like that. but by the second or the third verse, I was hooked. And Jack's admiration for that music led sort of indirectly into the Revels that he was later to found, and to 5 American Appalachian Christmas Revels that were based on music that sort of had its origins there. So Revels, some of you don't know what Revels is at all. We like to think of it as a sort of framework, a frame that you could put around experiencing a culture. So each year we take a culture or a time period and we do a reasonably deep dive with about 50 or 60 people, that's adults and children, and over a period of about 3.5 months or so, we kind of steep them in the culture. And that is by stories, by songs, by little snippets of information. But mostly we rely on information that either we've gathered over the years or comes directly from what we call tradition bearers. And that concept of a tradition bearer is somebody that we can rely on as a guide, somebody who can open the door to a particular culture. It's not always, it may be a very subjective view of the culture, it has to be, but we look for an authentic note somewhere in the Revels. And over the years, we've done a lot of different versions of that. When we did Georgia Sea Island music, we had Bessie Jones and Frankie and Doug Quimby. Occasionally we do Native American material. We had Leon Joseph Littlebird, who is a Native American. For gospel, we Janice Allen or the Silverleaf Singers. For Arabic material, we had Karim Nagy. Dmitry Pokrovsky in 1990 came over with his entire troupe the same year that the wall came down. And we had an American-Russian Revels. And we discovered that the Russians do mummers plays that are scatological and wonderful, and we did them side by side. And that the Russians love to sing shape note music. You're going to hear a lot more of that later on. That's some in our show. Very briefly, the background to the Appalachian story is that in England, the Industrial Revolution kind of wiped out a lot of the folk songs that were passed on through oral tradition. They were kind of drying up. And then this woman, Olive Dame Campbell, who was the wife of a government official, was traveling through Appalachia and actually started to take note of some songs that she recognized. One in particular, Barbary Allen, that is a ballad from, that has origins in Welsh and Scottish going back to the 1700s. And that sort of led to this kind of interest that Cecil Sharp picked up on, and he came over with Maud Carpelese, and we had this phenomenon of the song catchers, people going around with recording devices and kind of taking these ballads that were kind of lost to the British, but had been preserved in Appalachia. Now you're going to learn from Jake all the things that those people did not pick up, and there were a lot. There's a whole other story which is quite fascinating, and so we're looking forward to doing that. That's pretty much all I want to set this up as. Our sixth version of the Appalachian Revels is we have these two who are musicians this year, or part of our musicians, and Libby, I know, comes from where? Yeah, right. I couldn't hear you.
East Tennessee.
East Tennessee. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
East Tennessee, right. Okay. So right in the area there, and we have a whole sort of line, a thread to follow there through the music.
Appalachian music is tuning and retuning.
For once, the banjo was done first. Well, that first tune was called Old Buck. We learned it from a recording of a guy named Tommy Jarrell, who lived in Toast, North Carolina, and is kind of the godfather of old-time fiddle. He was a major figure in the folk revivalist generation that brought so much of this music down to young people like Libby and myself, because Tommy drove a highway grader for his job. He was in charge of taking care of the highways, but he could not drive. So he would welcome people into his home and teach them tunes in exchange for them driving him around to different places. So he very quickly rose to prominence and was such a welcoming figure that a lot of people kind of cottoned onto his style, and some recordings that he made with a frequent musical collaborator by the name of Fred Cochran kind of set the standard for banjo fiddle duets like ours. So we like to open our shows with one of their tunes. And this next one is called Sugar Babe, and it originally comes from a man named Doc Boggs, who was a coal miner from Wise County, Virginia, which, for those familiar with the geography of Virginia, is the little triangle down at the corner of the big triangle. And he spent most of his life living and working in segregated coal camps there, and would sneak into the black sections of the camp and learn from the musicians that he met there, and kind of develop this really unique, unusual finger style, banjo style that I do not do, so we're going to do it my way. But the song is called Sugar Babe.
Sugar baby now, I ain't got no honey baby now. more could a poor boy do? Says it's all I can say and it's all I can do, but I can't make a living with you. I can't make a living with you. So I ain't got no sugar baby now. Who'll rock the cradle and who'll sing the song? So who'll rock the cradle when I'm gone? Who'll rock the cradle when I'm gone? I'll rock the cradle and I'll sing the song. So I'll rock the cradle when you're gone. I'll rock the cradle when you're gone. I can't get along this way. I can't get along this way. Ain't got no use for that red rocking chair. I ain't got no sugar baby now. I ain't got no honey baby now.
This next one is called Twin Sisters, and we got it from a recording of a fiddler named O.C. Helton, who lived in Asheville, North Carolina. And O.C. was a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, who are some Cherokee folks who managed to stay down there in the mountains in North Carolina after the Indian Removal Act. And he learned to play the fiddle from a formerly enslaved black man who worked in the same distillery as his father. So he's kind of at the intersection of all these things that I like to study. These African and Native American contributions to the music that we play, which is so frequently miscast as this preserved Scottish or Irish or English music, but which changed irrevocably from the moment it arrived on this continent.
like part of the story of Appalachia is displacement, whether that's Native people that were displaced or people who ended up moving there from being displaced from their homes and then were moved out again because it wasn't convenient that they lived there anymore. And this song kind of speaks, or the story of this song speaks to that a little bit. If you've ever been to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, it's a beautiful place, but lots of people used to live there. And when the park was created in the 40s, they were all moved out into surrounding areas. Some of them, their homes were bought, and some of them didn't have a choice. And it broke up a lot of communities, and it's an amazing park, like without a doubt, like I'm glad that it exists. But there is this one community in a place called Cades Cove. And if you ever go to the park, go to Cades Cove. It's gorgeous. It's been kind of preserved. They've kept a few of the like structures intact there. There are still people who remember like living there as children, but pretty much that generation has left us. But in the 40s, there was a sort of exodus of people. They were all moved out, and one of those people was Austin Harmon. And he was a banjo player and singer, and he was part of the Harmon family. And they were a family that had, I think there were 6 different people who were recorded singing lots of East Tennessee ballads. And he moved to Maryville, which is where I'm from, and that's where he was recorded in 1939, I believe. So this is one of Austin Harmon's songs. It's called Went Up on the Mountaintop.
This next one is called 8th of January, and we learned it from a guy named Cooge Bertram, who lived in Fentress County, Tennessee, but was best known as more of a Kentucky musician because he played so much up there. And back when a lot of these early artists were getting recorded in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s, the record industry was interested in grouping artists into 2 categories, which were hillbilly music and race music. And hillbilly music was white people playing this kind of music, and race music was black people playing blues or jazz. And while there was some leeway for white musicians to cross over into race music, there was none for anything to go in the other direction. So black fiddlers and banjo players like Cooge Bertram were passed over and did not get recorded. And fortunately, he made some excellent recordings late in his life, where he's like in his 70s and his grandchildren are running around, so he's trying to play all these really hard fiddle tunes, and they're like, "Play Pop Goes the Weasel!" He's like, "Get out of here!" He eventually gave in and played Pop Goes the Weasel. We're not going to do that now. This is called 8th of January. Before, but a big part of the story of Appalachian music in this country is actually the folk revival that took place in the 60s, 70s, etc. Do you want to switch the next two? Never mind. And this next one is a song that comes out of that. It's called The Wedding Dress Song.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
We just call it Wedding Dress on our set lists.
So I never know if there's a real name or not. But it comes from a woman named Peggy Seeger.
Hey, my little Dodie gal, don't you guess? Better be making your wedding dress, wedding dress, wedding dress. Better be making your wedding dress. Hey, it's already made, trimmed in brown, stitched around with the golden crown, golden crown, golden crown, stitched around with the golden crown. Hey, it's already made, trimmed in white, gonna get married on Sunday night, Sunday night, Sunday night, gonna get married on Sunday night. Hey, it's already made, trimmed in green, prettiest thing that you ever seen, ever seen, ever seen, prettiest thing that you ever seen.
tune comes from one of my very favorite fiddlers, a guy named Manco Sneed, who was also a Cherokee fiddler from Cherokee, North Carolina. And he was part of a fiddling, banjo-playing family. All of his brothers played something. Manco was one of 5. Manco, Osco, Pico, and Campbell. That was also only 4. I misremembered, I'm sorry. And I've had the great pleasure of going to Cherokee and performing Manco's music and getting to meet some of his family there and play at his family reunion. So I'm always excited to get to present his music when there's a chance to do so. And this is one of our favorites. It's called Goodbye Girls. And it's decidedly not spooky. It's called Smoke Behind the Clouds, and it is the title track of our CD.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Smoke behind the clouds. Hey, oh, pretty little mister, all dressed up so fine. Come to Chattanooga and change your name to mine. me. He lives on Lookout Mountain way up in Tennessee. Hey, oh, pretty little mister, all dressed up so fine. Come to Chattanooga and change your name to mine. He said he loved me some. He threw his arms around me. I thought my time had come. Hey, oh, pretty little mister, all dressed up so fine. Come to Chattanooga and change your name to mine.
Thank you.
We'll end on a spooky one.
This also comes from O.C. Helton, whom we talked about earlier. It's called Pocahontas. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4.
questions from the floor now. Anyone who would like to come up, please feel free to ask questions of Jake, Libby, Paddy, Megan. I've got one question for you, just personally. Your own musical influences. How did you shift? What was your own background that you shifted from? Was it funk and soul?
Yeah, there wasn't that much of a shift. I don't think of them as being all that different.
Were you playing the banjo in soul and funk?
No, I was playing electric guitar at the time, so similar shaped, but a slightly different technique situation. Well, no, it makes a difference. Learning to play fiddle was harder. So that's where I started out. I guess I kind of stumbled into it by accident. I went into this Ethiopian restaurant on U Street in downtown DC, for anyone who's familiar with DC. And there was this couple up getting ready to play, and this woman had a washboard and this dude had a banjo, and I was like, well, this is gonna be terrible because I'm from the city and we don't do washboards and banjos there. Little did I know, this band, Megan, Jean, and the KFB, started playing, and she is like a Tisch-trained musical theater singer, and so she started singing and everyone's jaw hit the floor, and I was watching this guy play banjo. He was doing this thing I'd never quite seen before. So I went up to him after the show and I was like, what was that? What was that style? Why are you hitting down with your fingernail like that? And he kind of explained to me, oh, that's claw hammer banjo. The banjo originally comes from Africa, and the way that the ancestor instruments are played over there looks a lot more like this than what you may have seen in a bluegrass band, where they're kind of, picking up with all their different fingers. So.
How about you, Libby?
Well, for me, I grew up mostly playing classical music, but when I was sometime in elementary school age, I did take some fiddle lessons with a woman named Sarah Perkle. So I stopped doing that probably when I was like 10 or 11. But then I came back to it from a very different kind of approach when I was, I guess, like 19 or 20. I was a junior in college, and I was just feeling really homesick. I was living in Chicago at the time. And so I slowly, actually not so slowly, switched over. And now it's like what I do. It's pretty much my career. I still do a lot of classical stuff, but most of the gigs that I play are in the old time vein, I would say.
So I grew up during that great folk scare you were talking about earlier, and guys like Mike Seeger and his group and a lot of the other folks, they were lucky enough to get a lot of their music directly from the source. I mean, they could actually play with some of these people or people that knew those people. How do you think your experience is different getting, I assume, almost all your music at least secondhand or off records or from storytellers? How is that different than the experience of the founding folk revival generation?
Jake and I have talked about this a little before, but I would say the biggest difference, well, first of all, we can explore a lot of different regional styles just from like the comfort of our home in front of our computer now. So what that means is like, I think the way people tend to approach it is that means that they get really detailed about like emulating each style or each fiddler that they hear. Because if you can listen to a fiddler from West Virginia and a fiddler from North Carolina and a fiddler of East Tennessee all next to each other, you start to hear those differences a little bit more clearly because they're like side by side. But beyond like the technical part of things, I would say the biggest difference is less like human relationships with the musicians who you're learning from. And a lot of people do still have mentors. I wouldn't actually consider myself to have like a particular fiddle mentor. I know Jake has some mentors that would probably talk about, but yeah, I would say that's the biggest difference. You're learning from recordings and you do what you can to learn about who those people were, but you don't have the same connection to those people as human beings or to their communities as folks who go like directly to the source did. So I don't know, there's something to be said for relationships. I think that we tend to separate the music from the people that it came from for that reason a little bit more now.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think that's something a lot of people raise when they're talking about the issues of folks like me, who I'm not from Appalachia. My family is historically related to this musical tradition for sure, but it's not something that's in my immediate community. And the fact that I can go on a website and pull up thousands of recordings of fiddle tunes from these people and learn them without ever going to the place where they lived or meeting anyone that they knew or knowing how they talked or what they thought or how they ate or anything else really mirrors a lot of the other types of resource extraction that we see going on in Appalachia. And the exploitation of the local populace. And one of the things I've grappled with a lot is what to do with the tunes that I don't feel like I have a personal connection to. If I'm playing something from Cooge Bertram, for example, this is someone who is part of the black string band tradition that I know developed largely amongst the slaves in the Chesapeake Bay region from whom I am descended. So I feel a very close personal connection to that. When we play things from the Harmon family, like I'm doing it because Libby's here and Libby wants to do it. But in my own musical life, I have a hard time relating to that sometimes. And that's where I think those in-person mentorships do come in. I have one fiddler in particular, Judy Hyman, who's kind of been my fiddle hero from day one. And over the course of probably 4 or 5 years, we've developed a pretty close relationship. And she and her husband actually just produced a new CD that I recorded a couple weeks ago. And getting to spend more time with her and really dig really deep into her style taught me a lot. It helped me learn a lot more about why the folks who are maybe in their 50s and 60s now have such detailed understandings or such accurate imitations of what people back in the day were doing. Because recordings get you really only so far unless you're incredibly dedicated and incredibly good at listening. And getting to see someone in front of you is a totally different thing on a personal level and also, I think, on a musical level.
Could you, Libby, explain the difference between your two violins?
So this is actually Jake's, but the difference is that this has an extra string and obviously looks very different than mine. That's the biggest difference. It has 5
Just an
strings.
extra strings?
Yeah. Yeah, and so what was happening when I was switching around...
Since you said it looked different.
Yeah.
See
Oh, yeah. See.
Trying to look over.
It's a little unconventional, I would say.
Yes.
But when I was switching back and forth, the reason I would do that is because, like I was talking about the tunings, and when you have that 5th string, you can even push those tunings a little bit farther, and it just creates a different resonance and a different feeling. It's like in Baroque music, if you're familiar with Baroque music, there were keys for certain moods, and I like to think about tunings that way too. So that's pretty much the difference.
What is the extra string?
I guess when it's tuned in like a standard violin tuning, it's a C. So it's like a viola violin fusion situation. Yeah.
Thank you.
As a member here at First Parish, a former Revels cast member, shape note singer, and a hammer dulcimer player, this is a convergence of so much of my life right here. You mentioned about Bella Fleck, and I can tell you as one person, as a hammer dulcimer player, going into an old time jam, it's like it's not one of the 5 instruments that God said could play old time. So I'm wondering, there's bluegrass, and there's other things. What are you seeing as the new influences upon that music, and how is it changing so it's not calcifying, and where do you kind of see it going?
I think the biggest change that I see, even taking place just in the years that I've been playing, which are not that many, is that the hotshot young people pushing the boundaries in old time also play bluegrass. And the hotshot young people pushing the boundaries in bluegrass also play old time. And increasingly, I feel like we're seeing albums come out that kind of push the boundary between the two of them and kind of play with the idea that, these are 2 separate genres rather than maybe different ends of a spectrum. And it's something that I've been finding really exciting. So that's been the most notable new trend for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's a thing that I've noticed also. I also have a lot of friends. I feel like this is probably a thing. I don't know that this is new, but I think what happens is people come into old time music for a particular reason. They're like drawn to the sort of like trancey weirdness that it is. Like if you've ever been around an old time jam, like a really deep old time jam, it's like you just play the same tune for like 10 minutes.
30 minutes.
Yeah, or more. Yeah, 10 minutes minimum, really. And I think that draws in a certain kind of person, and therefore I have a lot of friends who have moved through old time music into like slightly more experimental versions of old time music or like takes on it. And I've noticed that a lot in my own community, but I do think that's probably just, I'm not sure that's just this generation. I think that's like a turnover thing. Like I think people come to old time music, they're like, wow, this is really cool. They're cool with it for like 5 years, 10 years, and then they're like, all right, now how can I like really drive this tranciness home?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And then they come back when they're 60.
Yeah, yeah. Like,
Are you seeing any other influences from any other fusion sort of thing coming into this type of music?
I think those projects are always taking place, but I think fusion acts as a rule are kind of looked down on in the scene right now.
Yeah.
Which is not great.
Don't you think influences, I mean, from my perspective as a consumer, I mean, I really love, you know, Gillian Welsh, and then I love Mumford & Sons. They've really brought the banjo back into pop. And I think the Americana fusion is really happening. I don't see it as something that's dwindling. I think they've re-energized music by bringing that into mainstream rock.
Yeah, go ahead.
We're both like, we have a lot of opinions on this. I want to like choose my words carefully because I don't want to sound like a snob.
That's my job.
But as far as the Americana fusion goes and sort of the like pop use of, or I don't even know if I would call that pop, but yeah, the Americana use of old time sounds, you can kind of go back to what Jake was saying about like that sort of idea of resource extraction. Like when people use these traditions, these deep traditions, as sort of like a sound effect in their music, as opposed to really studying the music and then like giving it like respect and space within whatever fusion they're doing, that's when I tend to not be as drawn to it. That being said, the banjo is definitely having a moment right now. I would also attribute that to like Rhiannon Giddens, and not just Mumford & Sons. So, but yeah, the banjo's having a moment for sure. Yeah,
I think I would echo the same thing. As a banjo player, a lot of those acts tend to kind of frustrate me on that same level because, you know, you go to your local indie joint or whatever and there's just this dude playing banjo with a guitar pick. And it's just like, I understand that you're doing this thing that feels good to you, but also put that down. You did not pay your dues to be part of this. You know, I don't think it's my place to be gatekeeper. I would never say that to somebody for sure.
Right.
But at the same time, I do think there's a deeper level of, within the Americana scene especially, and this is something I try to be aware of in my own musical practice because of my own background and where I'm from. There's a lot of rich kids in cowboy costumes who've never seen a horse. That's its own vibe. So I think part of the thing that we're talking about here is that the old time scene in and of itself is pretty insular and pretty, we view ourselves as being very distinct from Americana or folk or bluegrass or country, even though from the outside all these things kind of look like facets of the same jewel. So we're speaking from this deeply brainwashed inside perspective on what we do. But at the same time, I definitely think on a wider level, you know, bands like Rising Appalachia exist and are doing super well. So there's more going on.
Yeah, totally.
I was interested if you could tell a little history of Appalachian music. And by the way, it's Appalachian, not Appalachian Trail, Appalachian music, I gather, or either. But you said something about how it's not about the preservation of Scottish and Irish traditional music, perhaps. But surely immigrants from Scotland and Ireland brought traditional music as immigrants, didn't they, to Appalachia and influence fiddle styles and banjo styles?
Yeah,
and
for sure.
Is traditional music of the kind that you're playing vibrant in the Appalachian region today, in the contemporary scene?
Well, I guess we can.
I'll let
do
you
this
answer
in
the
parts.
first part
Yes,
of that.
Yes. So yes, Scottish and Irish immigrants brought a lot to the table for this musical tradition, and definitely the fingerprints are all over it, especially if you listen to fiddlers like O.C. Helton or Manco Sneed. The ornamentation, the groove is all there. That being said, those people came to this country after the fiddle tradition was well established in the United States. The first fiddlers that we know of, or some of the very first fiddle players that we know of in this country, were enslaved African people who were brought over and instructed in playing the fiddle for their masters' dances. Now, a lot of those masters would demand that they learn Scottish tunes, because that's what was hip at the time, but from the moment people were brought onto the slave ships, they were being made to dance European dances, dance to European instruments, and sometimes they would mix their African instrumentation with European instrumentation and mix the dances together. And so you get square dancing, right, where this is clearly related to a bunch of different European court dances, but black people invented square dance calling and invented certain dance moves and certain styles of movement. You get the percussive dance tradition that goes along with that, that blends different things from percussive dance in Europe and in the Americas already and in Africa. Everything is a hodgepodge. And I'm always hesitant to say what comes from where, simply because we don't have a super accurate picture of what indigenous music in the Southeast happened at the time of contact, because too many of us died too fast. And we don't know what African music would have sounded like at the time that the transatlantic slave trade started up, because too many of us died too fast. And within that story, I think there's a lot of blank space. So absolutely, there's a huge contribution there. I think what I meant to push back against with that statement was a scholar like, say, Cecil Sharp, who came up earlier, who came over here and decided before ever getting to the region, oh, these Appalachian people are singing like pure Elizabethan ballads, and they came over here and moved into the hills and never talked to anybody else, and nothing ever changed, which was very much the school of thought for a while when it came to Appalachia, and which was wrong and was just another way of co-opting the region to serve an external political purpose. Cecil Sharp overlooked tons of people who were part of the traditions he was trying to document. Alan Lomax did the same thing when he went down and took a different tack years later. So there's a lot of there are a lot of things that were left out of the folkloric archive, and though I would never accuse someone like Alan Lomax or Cecil Sharp of faking things, because this tradition was clearly super important to them, they didn't tell the entire truth. So a lot of what scholars like myself and what various mentors of mine are doing is going back and looking at these people who have not necessarily gotten their due. And now I'm going to let Libby talk. So.
Just like, just to add on to that a little bit, and then I'll answer the part about the state of things today. But in that same vein, I've been doing some research into some ballads that came from the county that I lived in, and it's really frustrating from like a perspective looking back, because I'll read about accounts of people singing about local events and like things during the Civil War, I don't know, like local crimes that happened, but you don't get those recorded necessarily because it was such a trend to only think that a ballad was valuable if it was super old, like if it came from like Elizabethan era ballads. So what's happened is there are a lot of American ballads, like ballads that were generated here through local stories and local folklore that didn't get recorded, which I think is a tragedy, because how cool would it be to hear like the local news via song from back in the day. But anyways, I feel like it's alive and well in Appalachia today. I think we're going through a period where people are really like starting to own their like hillbilliness, which I love. Like when I was growing up, it's just changed even in the last few years. I feel like I didn't feel any kind of pride at all for having grown up in that area. And I think it's a thing that people are really owning now. And so like part of that is like reclaiming the music and being like, this isn't some like antiquated thing. This is like fresh and new and relevant as ever. So there's lots of young people playing it. Like we go to festivals and drink and yell and dance and play tunes, and it's not like it's a huge nerd convention, don't get me wrong, but
it's very Comic-Con.
Yeah,
fiddles
but it's very much alive is what I'm trying to say. The tradition is happening, which is great.
You've talked a lot about the Scottish-Irish influence and the African influence, but you mentioned in passing Native Americans. Can you say more about that? I know very little about their musical tradition or how it got fused into this.
Yeah, so sadly there isn't very much for sure that can be said. We know that there was a strong fiddle tradition amongst certain tribes in the Southeast, that there remains a very strong fiddle tradition amongst tribes now in the West and in the Midwest and in Canada and in Alaska. There has always been a strong thread of fiddle tradition in the indigenous communities in the United States.
But where did that come from? They did not play fiddles in the...
We don't know.
They did not play fiddles in the 1300s, I suspect.
Well, we don't know, right? Like there are instruments like the Apache fiddle, for instance, where no one particularly agrees whether it's based on the European violin or not. It's an agave stock with one string, and you could say, sure, we don't have evidence of it prior to Columbus landing and settlers making contact, but there are similar instruments in Africa. Okay. There's just a lot of gray areas there. I would say we don't know where they learned it. Probably there were many different avenues through which that influence landed. So when I'm looking at the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, which is where I have spent most of my time in this subject area, thinking about fiddlers like Manco Sneed, O.C. Helton, etc., the Cherokee Nation was a slaveholding nation, and at the height of the slave trade for them was 20% African American. Now, the narrative is white settlers came into the mountains and showed them how to play the fiddle, and they learned that way. But we also know that there were a ton of black people playing the fiddle at the same time, and that this group of people was 1/5 black. I don't necessarily buy that it didn't come from both places at once. And stories like O.C. Helton's, he learned from a black person, indicates to me that there's probably more than is being said. And sadly, we will never know. That branch of the tradition died out with Manco Sneed. He was the last one. And there are efforts underway to revitalize that are really incredible. But for the time being, if you want to check out more native fiddling stuff, I would definitely recommend looking up Métis music from the upper Midwest, checking out what's happening over in Oklahoma, check out what's happening in Canada and what's happening in Athabascan communities in Alaska.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jake, Libby, Patty.